Every old farmer in Ramsey County said Marta Lindgren would freeze before February. 3 cords of wood against the 8 needed. A widow with 2 children and a contraption of copper tubing wrapped around her flue. That won't change arithmetic, they told her. In February 1936, North Dakota recorded its coldest month in history. She wrapped copper tubing around her flue, but everyone in Devil's Lake said she was wasting time while her children faced death. A woman alone burning 3 cords when she needs 8 is a woman who freezes to death, the old farmer said. That contraption won't change arithmetic. In February 1936, the temperature hit 60 below zero. But 4 months earlier, Marta Lindgren had never soldered a pipe in her life. In October of 1935, the woodpile behind the Lindgren farmhouse held exactly 3 cords. Marta had counted them twice that morning, walking the stacked rows with her hand trailing along the rough-cut ends. 128 cubic feet per cord, 384 cubic feet total. Her husband Eric had cut most of it the autumn before, in the weeks before the oak fell wrong and crushed him against the frozen ground. 14 months now. 14 months of learning what a woman alone could and could not do on 160 acres of North Dakota wheatland that had grown nothing but dust and grasshoppers for 2 straight seasons. The farmhouse stood 16 feet by 20, tar paper over pine frame, with a single cast iron stove squatting in the main room like a black altar to survival. Upstairs, her children slept in a loft that caught whatever heat rose through the gaps in the floorboards. Thomas was 14 now, tall for his age, but thin from a summer of too much work and not enough meat. Kristen was 9, still young enough to believe her mother could fix anything. Marta touched the woodpile again. 3 cords. The old farmers said 8 was the minimum for a frame house through a North Dakota winter. 10 was safer. 12 if you wanted margin for a bad February. She had 3. The mathematics were simple. The solution was not. Gunnar Halvorsen arrived on the 3rd Tuesday of October, his wagon creaking up the dirt track that passed for a road. He was 67 years old, Norwegian like Marta's parents, with a face like leather left too long in the sun. He'd survived the hard winter of 1880, the great die-up of 86, and 3 wives who'd given him 7 children before the prairie took them one by one. He did not waste time on pleasantries. "Heard your boy's been cutting on weekends," Halvorsen said, climbing down from the wagon seat. "Heard you've got maybe 3 cords stacked." 3 1/4, Marta said. "Thomas added some last week." Halvorsen walked to the woodpile without asking permission. He pulled a piece from the stack, examined the grain, set it back, pulled another. His expression did not change, but his silence said enough. "Cottonwood," he said finally. "Some oak. The oak is good. The cottonwood burns fast and spits. It's what we could reach. The good timber's 3 miles out, along the river. Eric knew those stands." "Eric is dead." Halvorsen turned to face her. His eyes held something that might have been sympathy, might have been calculation. "A woman alone burning 3 cords when she needs 8 is a woman who freezes to death. That's not cruelty, Mrs. Lindgren. That's arithmetic." "Then I'll cut more." "With what? Your boy's in school 5 days a week. Your draft horse is 19 years old and half lame. A crosscut saw needs 2 people working proper, and even then a strong man cuts maybe a cord in 3 days. He spat into the dust. "You've got 6 weeks until first hard freeze. You cannot cut 5 cords in 6 weeks. Not alone. Not with a boy who should be studying his letters." Marta said nothing. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of dying grass and the promise of snow. Halvorsen softened just slightly. "I buried my Ingrid 36 years ago. January of 99. The cold doesn't care how hard you pray, Mrs. Lindgren. Doesn't care how much you loved your husband or how badly your children need their mother. What do you want, Mr. Halverson? I want to make you an offer. I'll buy your claim. Pay off the mortgage, $47, I'm told. Give you enough to get to Devil's Lake. Find a room, find work, housekeeper, laundress, something. Your children live. You live. The alternative. He gestured at the woodpile. The alternative is I find you in the spring. The offer was not unkind. Marta understood that. Halverson was not a cruel man, merely a practical one. He had watched this prairie kill the unprepared for 50 years. He had buried neighbors who thought they knew better. He was trying, in his way, to save her, but selling meant losing everything Eric had built. Every fence post he'd sunk, every acre he'd plowed, every night he'd lain awake planning how they'd expand, how they'd thrive, how they'd give their children something more than survival. His grave was on that land, on the small rise where the cottonwoods caught the morning light. Selling meant leaving him behind, and the money Halverson offered would cover the mortgage and perhaps 2 months of rent. It would not cover winter clothes for growing children, food through April, medicine if someone fell sick. It would buy survival barely, and only if nothing went wrong. Nothing ever went right on the prairie. Marta had learned that much. No, she said. Halverson studied her for a long moment. You have until the ground freezes to change your mind. After that, I can't help you. He climbed back onto his wagon, gathered the reins. I hope you find a miracle, Mrs. Lindgren. This winter's going to need one. She watched him drive away until the wagon disappeared into the brown distance. Then she turned back to the woodpile and began counting again, as if the numbers might change if she just looked hard enough. 3 cords. 8 needed. 6 weeks. No money, no help, no solution. The first cold wind of autumn cut through her dress like a blade, and Marta Lindgren understood for the first time that she might actually die here, might watch her children die here, unless she found an answer that no one believed existed. The answer came from a memory, and the memory came from steam. 3 days after Halverson's visit, Marta was heating water for laundry. The task consumed most of a day, hauling buckets from the well, filling the copper kettle, waiting for it to boil on the wood stove, pouring the hot water into the wash tub, repeating until her arms ached and her back screamed, and the pile of dirty clothes finally surrendered to lye soap and exhaustion. She stood by the stove, waiting for the 3rd kettle to boil, and watched the heat shimmer above the cast iron surface. The stovepipe rose through the ceiling into the loft above, black iron radiating warmth that she could feel from 3 feet away. Even when the fire burned low, that pipe stayed warm for hours. The metal held heat like a miser held coins. Her father's voice came to her then, unexpected and sharp, as if he were standing in the room. Heated water rises. Cold water sinks. The pot fills itself if you let it. She had been 8 years old, standing in her father's workshop in Trondheim, while he explained why the copper vessel near the baking oven never needed stirring. The water circulated on its own, he said. Hot water was lighter than cold water, so it rose to the top and pushed the cold water down to be heated again. A simple principle, an old principle. Something the Romans had understood, he claimed, though Marta had never been sure if that was fact or fatherly exaggeration. The pot fills itself if you let it. She looked at the stovepipe. She looked at the kettle. She looked at the ceiling where the loft caught whatever warmth rose from below. Then she walked to the barn, where Eric's tools still hung on their pegs, waiting for hands that would never hold them again. He had planned to bring water inside. That had been the dream for their 5th anniversary. A hand pump in the kitchen, a proper basin, hot water on demand like the fancy houses in town. He'd ordered the supplies 2 years before his death, paid $8.50 for 50 feet of copper tubing and another $3 for fittings and solder. The supplies had arrived from the Sears and Roebuck warehouse in Chicago 6 months before the oak tree fell. Marta found the tubing coiled on a shelf above the workbench, still wrapped in brown paper. Beside it sat a galvanized steel tank meant for livestock watering, 30 gallons capacity, never used. Eric's plumbing notes were tucked into a farmer's bulletin on domestic water systems, his handwriting cramped and careful in the margins. She carried everything into the house and spread it across the kitchen table. Thomas found her there 2 hours later, sketching diagrams by lamplight while the dinner pot cooled on the stove. "What is that?" he asked. "A problem," Marta said. "Maybe a solution. I'm not sure yet." She explained what she was thinking, using the same words her father had used 30 years before. Hot water rises, cold water sinks. If you wrapped copper tubing around the stovepipe where the heat was strongest and connected that tubing to a tank positioned higher than the stove, the water would circulate on its own. No pump, no electricity, just physics. The tank would fill with hot water. Hot water held heat longer than air. A 30-gallon tank at 140 degrees was like a small radiator, releasing warmth slowly into the room even after the fire burned down to coals. Every hour that tank radiated heat was an hour she didn't need to burn wood. "You think it would work?" Thomas asked. "I don't know. My father had something similar but smaller. Nothing this size." "What if it doesn't work?" Marta looked at the copper coil, the fittings, the careful diagrams. She thought about Halverson's arithmetic. 3 chords against 8, 6 weeks against 5 more needed. "If it doesn't work," she said, "we'll have wasted time we don't have, and we'll freeze like everyone expects. And if it does, then maybe we don't." She didn't sleep that night. She sat at the table with Eric's notes and the farmer's bulletin and a borrowed book on plumbing that Agnes Tevet had lent her 2 summers ago, meant for Eric's project. She calculated flow rates and temperature differentials and the weight of 30 gallons of water. She sketched platform designs and pipe routes and connection points. By morning, she had a plan. It was rough and uncertain, and based on principles she only half understood. But it was a plan. The alternative was waiting to die. Agnes Tevet arrived the following afternoon, having heard through the prairie's invisible telegraph that the Lindgren widow was building something strange. Agnes was 38, a widow herself for 6 years now, with 3 grown sons who cut her wood and mended her fences and gave her the one thing Marta lacked, labor she could trust. Agnes stood in the kitchen, staring at the copper tubing laid out across the table, the diagrams pinned to the wall, the tank waiting by the stove. "What in God's name is this?" Marta explained. "Hot water rises. Cold water sinks. The tank holds heat. The tank releases heat. Fewer hours burning means less wood needed." Agnes listened without interrupting. When Marta finished, Agnes shook her head slowly, the way she might shake it at a child who'd said something foolish but forgivable. "Hot water won't heat a house, Marta. You need fire for heat. This is just warm washing water. The tank radiates heat, like a stove, but slower. A stove is iron. This is water in a tin can. 30 gallons of water at 140 degrees holds more heat than you'd think. I've done the calculations." "Calculations." Agnes made the word sound like a curse. Eric was always doing calculations. Look where it got him. The words landed like a slap. Marta felt her face flush, her hands tighten into fists at her sides. But Agnes wasn't wrong. Eric had calculated the angle of that oak tree, calculated where it would fall, calculated wrong. "Every hour I spend on this is an hour not cutting wood," Marta said quietly. "I know that, but if I cut wood until my arms fall off, I still won't have enough. The arithmetic doesn't work, Agnes. Halverson was right about that much. I can't cut 5 cords in 6 weeks. Not with Thomas in school. Not with Magnus going lame. Then sell. Take Halverson's offer. And go where? Do what? Watch my children grow up in a boarding house while I wash other people's sheets for $3 a week? Agnes had no answer for that. She looked at the diagrams again, the copper tubing, the tank. Her expression softened into something like pity. You were always clever, Marta. Eric used to say so. Said you were smarter than him, even if you'd never admit it. She touched the copper coil, ran her finger along the smooth curve. But clever women die just as frozen as stupid ones. Don't let your children pay for your pride. She left without saying goodbye. Marta stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by copper and paper and the ghost of her husband's plans, and wondered if Agnes was right. Pride. Was that what this was? The refusal to admit defeat, to accept charity, to do the sensible thing and surrender? Or was it something else? The stubborn faith that solutions existed if you looked hard enough, that the universe didn't create problems without also creating answers, that her father's voice echoing across 30 years in an ocean might be pointing towards something real? She didn't know. She couldn't know. The only way to find out was to build the thing and see if it worked. Marta picked up the copper tubing and began to bend it into coils. Reverend Aldous Marsh arrived on the first Sunday of November, 3 days after the first snow dusted the fields white, and sent everyone scrambling to finish their preparations. He came in a borrowed automobile, an extravagance that announced the seriousness of his visit, and he brought with him a woman Marta didn't recognize, thin, gray-haired, holding a leather notebook like a weapon. Mrs. Lindgren. The Reverend's voice carried the particular warmth of a man who had practiced sounding concerned. We've come to assess your situation. Mrs. Foley here is with the County Relief Committee. Marta stood in the doorway, blocking their entry. Behind her, the half-built platform for the water tank rose like an accusation. Copper tubing lay coiled on the floor, tools scattered across the kitchen table. I haven't asked for relief, Marta said. No, you haven't. Reverend Marsh smiled, but his eyes moved past her, cataloging the interior. That's precisely what concerns us. A widow with 2 children facing winter with inadequate fuel supplies, and she hasn't asked for help. It suggests confusion, perhaps distress. I'm not confused. We've heard you're building some kind of apparatus instead of preparing properly for winter. Who told you that? The Reverend ignored the question. Mrs. Lindgren, the Relief Committee exists to help families in need, but we cannot help those who refuse to help themselves. If you're spending your time on, he gestured vaguely toward the interior, contraptions instead of securing adequate fuel, we have an obligation to ensure your children's welfare. The threat was clear, even wrapped in pastoral concern. County child welfare could remove children from homes deemed unfit. A widow without adequate fuel, without adequate food, without adequate income, a widow who appeared to be losing her grip on practical reality might lose more than her farm. Marta felt the cold certainty of fear settle into her chest. Not for herself, for Thomas and Kristen, sleeping upstairs, unaware that their mother's choices might cost them everything. My children are fed, she said, keeping her voice steady. My children are warm, my children are loved. What I build in my own home is my own business, Reverend. Pride is a sin, Mrs. Lindgren, especially when it endangers children. Eric left me tools and supplies. Using them isn't pride, it's honoring his work. Mrs. Foley wrote something in her notebook. The scratch of pencil on paper sounded like a verdict being recorded. Reverend Marsh leaned closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a confidence. I've spoken with Gunnar Halvorsen. He made you a fair offer, a generous offer considering the circumstances. You refused. That's my right. It is, but refusing reasonable help while pursuing, again the vague gesture, unreasonable projects raises questions about judgment, about capacity, about fitness. Say what you mean, Reverend. I mean that if you persist in this foolishness, the committee will have no choice but to contact the county about your children's welfare, for their protection. The words hung in the cold air between them. Marta thought about the platform half built in her kitchen, the copper tubing waiting to be wrapped around the stovepipe, the plan that might save her family or might be the desperate fantasy of a woman who couldn't accept reality. She thought about Thomas and Kristen, taken away, placed in some county home, growing up among strangers while their mother froze on a failed farm. She thought about Eric, who had never backed down from a challenge, who had crossed an ocean and built a life from nothing, who had died believing that courage and cleverness could overcome any obstacle. I've asked nothing from your committee, Reverend. I'm asking nothing now. My children will not become county charges, and you will leave my property. Reverend Marsh studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded to Mrs. Foley, who closed her notebook with a snap. We'll pray for you, Mrs. Lindgren. I hope Providence protects what your pride may not. They drove away in their borrowed automobile, leaving tracks in the thin snow. Marta stood in the doorway until they disappeared, then closed the door and leaned against it, trembling. She had perhaps 6 weeks before the coldest months. 6 weeks to finish the system, to prove it worked, to stockpile enough wood to survive even if it didn't. 6 weeks before the committee might return with more than notebooks, with sheriff's deputies and court orders and the power to take everything she had left. Thomas appeared at the top of the loft ladder, his face pale. I heard, he said. They can't really take us away, can they? Marta looked at her son, 14 years old, trying so hard to be the man his father had been, carrying burdens no child should carry. She wanted to promise him that everything would be fine, that she had it all figured out, that the authorities were bluffing, and the system would work, and spring would come, and they would laugh about this someday. But she had stopped making promises she couldn't keep the day Eric died. They can try, she said. We're going to make sure they fail. She crossed to the kitchen table, picked up the copper tubing, and began to work. The construction consumed November. Week 1. The platform. Marta built it from scrap lumber salvaged from the half-collapsed shed behind the barn, boards that Eric had said were too warped to use for anything proper, but that she straightened with steam and sweat and stubbornness. The platform had to hold the weight of the tank plus 30 gallons of water, 250 pounds, roughly pressing down on 4 legs braced against the ceiling joists of the loft space. Thomas helped when he wasn't in school, holding boards while she sawed, steadying the platform while she hammered. Kristen handed up nails and fetched tools and asked endless questions about why the water would move by itself and whether they could put fish in the tank, and if the fish would cook when the water got hot. No fish, Marta said. The water has to stay clean. But wouldn't cooked fish be nice? We could have fish whenever we wanted. We'd have fish once, and then we'd have dead fish water forever. No fish. By the end of the first week, the platform stood solid, shimmed level with scraps of cedar, braced against 3 walls, waiting for the tank it would hold. Week 2, the coil. 50 feet of copper tubing had to wrap around 6 inches of stovepipe in tight spirals. Each wrap about 19 inches of tubing, roughly 30 wraps total. The tubing came in a loose coil from the factory. Transforming it into precise spirals around the pipe required patience, strength, and heat. Marta learned from Eric's notes and from the farmer's bulletin and from trial and error. She filled a long trough with sand, heated the sand over the stove until it glowed, then buried lengths of tubing in the hot sand to soften the copper. Softened copper bent without kinking. Kinked copper blocked water flow. Blocked water flow meant a system that didn't work. Her hands blistered by the third day. The blisters broke by the fifth. By the seventh day, her palms were raw meat wrapped in rags, and she had 23 wraps completed around the stovepipe section she'd removed for the work. "Let me do some," Thomas said, watching her wince as she gripped the tubing. "You have school." "I can skip?" "No." Her voice was sharper than she intended. She softened it. "Your father wanted you educated. That doesn't change because I have sore hands." "Papa would have let me help." "Your papa isn't here." She regretted the words as soon as she spoke them. Thomas's face tightened, and he turned away without answering. That night she found him in the barn, currying Magnus even though the old horse didn't need it, just standing there in the cold with his forehead pressed against the horse's flank. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have said it like that. It's true, though." His voice was muffled against the horse's coat. "He's not here. He's never going to be here. And you're killing yourself trying to do everything alone." "I'm not alone. I have you. I have Kristen." "We're kids, Mama. We can't cut enough wood. We can't build that thing upstairs. We can't—" His voice cracked. "We can't keep you from working until your hands bleed." Marta crossed the barn and put her arms around her son, holding him the way she had held him when he was small enough to carry. He was too tall for it now, had to stoop to fit against her shoulder, but he didn't pull away. "Your father told me once that the hardest part of building something wasn't the work. It was believing it would work before you had any proof." She felt Thomas's breathing steady against her. "We're in the believing part right now, the hardest part. But we're not going to stay here forever. The work part comes, and then the proof part, and then we'll know. What if it doesn't work? Then we'll figure something else out. That's what Lindgrens do. We figure things out." She wasn't sure she believed it, but Thomas needed to hear it, so she said it and held him until the shaking stopped. Week 3. Connections and tank work. The galvanized tank needed 2 holes drilled, one low for the cold water outlet, one high for the hot water inlet. Marta had never drilled through metal before. The first attempt skidded across the tank's surface, leaving a scratch like a scar. The second attempt punched through at an angle, creating a hole she couldn't seal properly. She sat on the floor of the kitchen, staring at the ruined tank, and felt something crack inside her. It wasn't supposed to be this hard. Nothing was supposed to be this hard. She was a farmer's wife, a mother, a woman who'd never asked for more than a house and a family and enough food to fill their stomachs. She wasn't an engineer. She wasn't a plumber. She wasn't whatever kind of person built systems out of copper and faith and desperation. Kristen found her crying. "Mama, what's wrong?" Marta wiped her face with her ruined hands. "The tank is broken. I drilled the holes wrong." Kristen examined the damage with the serious attention of a 9-year-old who understood that this mattered. "Can we fix it?" "I don't know." "Papa always said mistakes were just lessons that hurt more than books. That's what he said when Thomas broke the plow blade that time." Marta stared at her daughter, this small person who remembered things Eric had said, who carried pieces of him forward into a world he would never see. The grief rose up fresh, as it sometimes did, overwhelming and total. But beneath the grief was something else, something stubborn. Mistakes are lessons that hurt more than books. The holes were wrong. Fine, she could seal them with solder, drill new ones, try again. The tank wasn't ruined, it was educated. She got up, found the soldering iron, and went back to work. By the end of week 3, the tank held water without leaking, with proper inlet and outlet holes positioned exactly where they needed to be. Week 4. Integration. The coil-wrapped stovepipe went back in place, rising through the ceiling into the loft where the tank waited on its platform. Copper tubing connected coil to tank through brass fittings. Eric's notes had been clear about that. The importance of brass between copper and steel to prevent corrosion. Exposed pipes got wrapped in wool rags for insulation. The first test came on a Thursday morning, with the fire burning steady and all 3 Lindgrens watching the system like it might explode. Nothing happened for 10 minutes. Then 15. Then 20. "Maybe it doesn't work," Thomas said. "Give it time." "How much time?" "I don't know." At the 30-minute mark, Marta climbed to the loft and touched the tank. Cool. She touched the inlet pipe from the coil. Warm. She touched the outlet pipe heading down to the stove. Cold. The water wasn't circulating. She checked the connections. She checked for kinks in the tubing. She checked the height differential between coil and tank. Everything looked right. Nothing was working. "There's an air bubble," Thomas said from below. "What?" "The water can't move because there's air trapped in the high point. I read about it in Papa's notes. You need a way to bleed the air out." Marta looked at her son, 14 years old, smarter than he knew, paying attention when she thought he wasn't. "How do we bleed it?" "There's supposed to be a valve at the top, a little one, just to let air escape." She climbed down, found Eric's notes, found the passage Thomas had remembered. He was right. She'd missed it, focused on the big pieces and forgetting the small one that made everything work. It took 2 more days to fabricate an air bleed valve from salvaged parts. On Saturday morning, with the fire burning and the system connected, and the air bled out through the tiny valve at the tank's highest point, they watched again. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Thomas climbed to the loft and touched the tank. "It's warm," he said. "Mama, it's getting warm." By noon, the tank held 30 gallons of water at 137 degrees. The thermometer Marta had borrowed from Agnes floated in a jar tied to the tank's rim, climbing steadily as the hours passed. The system worked. That night, after the children were asleep, Marta sat by the stove and let herself feel something she hadn't felt since Eric died. Hope. It was dangerous hope. It made you believe things might work out, and then the universe reminded you that oak trees fell wrong, and banks failed, and children got sick, and winter didn't care about your plans. But the tank was warm. The water was circulating. The physics her father had explained in a Trondheim workshop 30 years ago were doing exactly what he'd promised they would do. Maybe that was enough. Maybe hoping was allowed, just this once. Magnus collapsed on the last Sunday of November. The old horse had been pulling a sled of scavenged deadfall, branches and broken limbs gathered from the nearer groves, stuff that Eric had always said burned too fast to be worth hauling. But fast-burning fuel was better than no fuel, and Marta needed every scrap she could find. They were half a mile from home when Magnus's front legs buckled. The horse went down slowly, almost gently, like he was just deciding to rest. But he didn't get up. Thomas ran for help. Marta stayed with the horse, kneeling in the snow beside his great gray head, stroking his muzzle while he breathed in shallow, rattling gasps. "I'm sorry," she told him. "I'm sorry I worked you so hard. I'm sorry I needed more than you could give." Magnus's eyes, clouded with age, seemed to find her face. He exhaled once, long and slow, and something in him let go. He wasn't dead. Not quite. But whatever had been keeping him moving, the stubborn horse will that had pulled plows and sleds and wagon loads for 19 years, had finally run out. The neighbor who came to help, a farmer named Erickson from 3 miles south, looked at Magnus and shook his head. He might recover, might not. Either way, he won't be pulling anything this winter. "Can you?" Marta swallowed. Can you help me get the sled home? Erickson hitched his own horses to the sled and pulled it the rest of the way. He refused payment. Eric helped me roof my barn in 28. This is nothing. But it wasn't nothing. With Magnus down, there was no way to haul wood from the distant timber where the good oak grew. Thomas could drag small loads by hand, but small loads wouldn't close the gap between what they had and what they needed. 4.5 cords now, counting the deadfall on the broken-down sled. The system reduced her burn rate. The system held heat longer. The system might stretch 4.5 cords to cover a normal winter, but every old farmer in the county was saying this winter wouldn't be normal. The woolly caterpillars had worn their thickest bands. The muskrats had built their houses high. The geese had left early, as if they knew something the humans didn't. Marta stood by the useless horse, the inadequate woodpile, the fragile system that might or might not save them, and felt the mathematics crushing in from all sides. Then, on the first day of December, Olaf Bergstrom appeared. He came on skis, pulling a sled behind him, moving with the awkward grace of a man who'd learned to work around an old injury. Marta had met him perhaps 3 times in 15 years, a bachelor farmer from 6 miles north, so shy he could barely complete a sentence in company, so reclusive that some people whispered he was simple, or strange, or both. He stopped at the edge of her property and waited, as if asking permission to approach. Mr. Bergstrom? Marta walked toward him, confused. Is something wrong? Heard about your horse? His voice was rough from disuse. Brought some wood, had extra. She looked at the sled. It was loaded with split oak, a full cord at least, maybe more. Seasoned and dry, the good stuff, the kind that burned slow and hot and kept a house alive through the killing cold. Mr. Bergstrom, I can't. Eric lent me a harness once, 1929, never returned the favor. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable under her gaze. This returns it. It was charity. Marta knew it was charity, wrapped in a fiction of debt repayment offered by a man too proud to call it what it was. She should refuse. She had refused everyone else, Halverson's offer, the relief committee's interference, Agnes's worried suggestions. But her children were watching from the window, and winter was watching from the sky, and the mathematics didn't care about pride. Thank you, she said. Will you stay for coffee? He helped her stack the wood, another pair of hands faster than she could have managed alone. When they finished, he stood by the stove warming his hands, and his eyes found the copper coils wrapped around the pipe, the tank visible through the open loft hatch, the system she'd built from desperation and memory. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, my grandmother in Bergen had something like this, kept her water hot all winter. Did it work? She lived to be 93. He almost smiled. Died in her sleep with a pot of warm water ready for morning tea. He left without asking questions, without offering advice, without any of the doubt or dismissal she'd come to expect. Just a nod, a word about Bergen, and then the slow ski glide back toward his distant farm. 5.5 cords now, a system that worked, children who were healthy, a threat from the county that hadn't materialized. December stretched ahead, cold and uncertain. The old farmers said the worst was coming, the kind of winter that killed the unprepared and tested the strong and didn't much care about the difference. But for the first time since Eric died, Marta Lindgren thought she might be ready for it. Christmas came quietly. They had no money for presents, so they made what they could. Thomas carved a wooden spoon for Marta, working in secret in the barn during the freezing afternoons. Kristen drew a picture of their family, all 4 of them, with Eric watching from a cloud at the top of the page, smiling down at the wife and children he had left behind. Marta knitted mittens for Thomas, embroidered handkerchiefs for Kristen, and baked a cake with the last of the sugar and the precious hoarded eggs. They read the Christmas story by lamplight while the stove burned low and the tank radiated its captured warmth into the room. Outside, the thermometer read 15 below zero. Inside, the air stayed warm enough that they could sit without shivering, could read without their breath fogging the pages, could pretend for one evening that they were a normal family in a normal house with nothing to fear from the world outside. "Do you think Papa can see us?" Kristen asked. "I think he can," Marta said. "Do you think he's proud of us?" Marta looked at the copper coils, the elevated tank, the system she'd built with bleeding hands and broken faith, and a memory of her father's voice. She thought about Eric, who had crossed an ocean and carved a farm from prairie sod, and died believing that hard work and cleverness could overcome anything. "Yes," she said, "I think he's very proud." The new year arrived with temperatures that cracked trees and froze the mucus in cattle's nostrils. -20, -25, -30. The system held. The tank stayed warm through the long nights. The woodpile diminished more slowly than Marta had dared hope. 4 cords remaining, then 3.5. But January kept coming, day after grinding day, and the burn rate held steady at 1/12 of a cord, and the mathematics, finally, impossibly, began to work in her favor. Gunnar Halvorsen appeared in mid-January, stomping snow from his boots at her door. "Still here," he said. "Still here." He looked at the system, really looked at it this time, walking around the stove, studying the coils, climbing the ladder to examine the tank. His face gave nothing away. "It's working," he said finally. "It's working." December isn't winter, though. January's worse. February's death. "I know." He climbed down from the loft and stood facing her. This old man who'd survived 50 winters and buried 3 wives and told her she would die. "I hope you make it, Mrs. Lindgren. I mean that. I know you do. But if you don't, if the worst comes and you need help, send the boy. I'll come." He left without renewing his offer to buy the claim. Marta didn't know if that meant he'd given up on acquiring her land or if he'd simply accepted that she would never sell. Either way, the offer was gone. There was only forward now. On the 27th of January, the Weather Bureau sent word through the mail. Extended cold expected, below normal temperatures. Prepare for possible record conditions. Marta read the notice, looked at her woodpile, 3 cords remaining, looked at her system, looked at her children. Then she banked snow against the foundation, stuffed rags in every crack, and began to pray. The Arctic air arrived on January 29th. It came without warning or mercy, a wall of cold that dropped temperatures 30 degrees in 6 hours. By midnight, the thermometer outside the kitchen window read 42 below zero. By dawn, it had fallen beyond the thermometer's lowest marking. The world outside turned to iron and glass. Tree branches shattered in the stillness. The well water froze in the bucket between the pump and the house. The air itself seemed to crystallize, each breath a knife in the lungs. And then Kristen woke with a fever. The fever started small. Marta noticed it first in Kristen's eyes, that glassy, distant look children get when their bodies turn inward to fight. By the time she pressed her palm to her daughter's forehead, the heat was unmistakable. 101 degrees by the old mercury thermometer she kept in the medicine box. "My throat hurts," Kristen whispered. "I know, sweetheart. I know." Outside, the temperature continued to fall. 42 below at midnight, 46 below by 4 in the morning. The stove burned hot and steady, fed every 2 hours through the long night, and the copper coils glowed with conducted heat, and the tank in the loft radiated its warmth down through the floor. Inside the Lindgren house, the air held at 58 degrees, cold enough to see your breath at the edges of the room, warm enough to survive. But Kristen's fever climbed faster than the temperature fell. By dawn on January 30th, the thermometer outside had stopped registering, somewhere below 50 degrees, in territory the old instrument couldn't measure. The thermometer pressed to Kristen's forehead read 103. Marta knew what that meant. She'd seen fever take children before, in the old country and the new. The body burning itself from the inside, the brain cooking in its own skull, the convulsions that came when the heat rose too high. Children died from fever. Children died from fever even in warm houses with doctors nearby and medicine ready. She had no doctor. The nearest one was in Devil's Lake, 12 miles away, through drifts that had already reached 6 feet in the low places. No horse could make that journey. No automobile could push through the walls of snow. Even if she could somehow reach town, she couldn't leave Thomas alone to tend both the fire and his sister. She had no medicine beyond aspirin and willow bark tea. No way to break the fever except cool cloths and prayer and the desperate hope that Kristen's body would fight off whatever had invaded it. What she did have was hot water. The tank held 30 gallons at 134 degrees. She could draw off warm water without heating a separate kettle. She could soak cloths and press them to Kristen's forehead and neck and wrists, cooling the fever without chilling the child, working continuously without stopping to tend a second fire. Thomas. Her son appeared at her elbow, his face tight with fear. I need you to keep the stove fed. Every hour, check the fire. Keep it hot but not roaring. We can't waste wood, but we can't let it die either. What about Kristen? I'll take care of Kristen. Your job is the fire. Can you do that? He nodded, jaw set. 14 years old, carrying a weight that would have broken grown men. Good boy. Now go. The next 72 hours blurred together into a single endless night. Marta worked in a trance of exhaustion, moving between her daughter's bedside and the tank, drawing warm water, soaking cloths, pressing them to burning skin, waiting, replacing, repeating. She counted the minutes between temperature checks. She measured the slight fluctuations in Kristen's fever like a sailor watching a barometer in a hurricane. 103.2, 103.5, 103.8. The fever rose despite everything she did. By the evening of January 30th, it had reached 104. Kristen drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling about things that weren't there. Her father walking through the door, the chickens learning to fly, a bear made of snow that wanted to be her friend. Stay with me, Marta whispered. Stay with me, sweetheart. Stay here. Thomas kept the fire burning. He hauled wood from the pile in loads so small he could carry them alone, struggling through drifts that reached his waist even in the sheltered space between house and woodpile. His face turned red, then white, then red again as he cycled between the killing cold outside and the barely adequate warmth inside. The wind rose on the 31st, gusts to 40 miles per hour, driving snow sideways, reducing visibility to nothing. Ground blizzard conditions, even if help existed, it couldn't reach them now. And the temperature kept falling. Marta stopped checking the outside thermometer. It didn't matter anymore whether the air was 50 below or 60 below or colder still. What mattered was inside, the fire burning, the water circulating, the tank radiating, the small circle of warmth that kept them alive while the world outside turned to murder. On the morning of February 1st, Kristen's fever spiked to 104.5. Marta had been awake for 36 hours. Her hands shook as she wrung out the cloths. Her vision blurred at the edges. She kept seeing things in the corners of her eyes. Shadows that moved, figures that disappeared when she turned to look. "She's dying," said a voice in her head that sounded like her mother's. "Your daughter is dying, and there's nothing you can do." "No." She said it out loud, startling herself. "No. The fever has to break. Bodies fight. Children survive." She dipped another cloth in the warm water, pressed it to Kristen's wrists, where the blood ran close to the surface. The technique was old. Her grandmother had taught it to her mother. Her mother had taught it to her. Cool the blood, cool the body, trust the process. But the process was failing. The fever wasn't breaking, and somewhere outside, in the howling white darkness, the temperature had fallen to 52 below zero. Thomas found her collapsed against the bed frame sometime after midnight. "Mama, Mama, wake up." She came awake with a gasp, disoriented, terrified. "Kristen, she's sleeping. Her fever's the same. Mama, you have to sleep too. You can't keep going like this. I can't leave her. I'll watch her. I'll wake you if anything changes. But if you die from exhaustion, we all die. You know that." He was right. She knew he was right. The same brutal arithmetic that had governed everything since Eric's death. A mother who couldn't function was a mother who couldn't save anyone. 2 hours, she said. "Wake me in 2 hours." "I will." She didn't remember lying down. She didn't remember closing her eyes. She simply stopped existing for a while, falling into a darkness so complete it might have been death itself. When she woke, gray light was filtering through the frost-covered windows. The fire was burning, the tank was warm, and Thomas was sitting beside his sister's bed with tears streaming down his face. "She's cooler," he said. "Mama, I think she's cooler." Marta lunged for the thermometer, pressed it to Kristen's forehead with hands that trembled. The seconds stretched like hours. When she finally pulled it back and read the number, her knees buckled. 102. Still fever, still dangerous, but falling. The crisis was breaking. The cold held for 2 more weeks. February 1936 would be recorded as the coldest month in North Dakota history. At Parshall, 60 miles to the west, the temperature reached 60 degrees below zero, a state record that would stand for decades. At Devil's Lake, the mercury averaged 21 below for 5 consecutive weeks. At Fargo, the temperature stayed below zero for 37 straight days. Remote towns went weeks without outside contact. Store shelves emptied to 2 days of supplies. Livestock froze where they stood, becoming statues of ice that wouldn't thaw until spring. And across the county, people died. Marta learned about the Jensens on February 8th, when the first rescuers finally broke through the drifts. The family had lived 7 miles west, a frame house like hers, a wood stove like hers, a father and mother, and 2 children not much older than Thomas and Kristen. Their coal delivery had never arrived. They'd burned their furniture first, then their fence posts, then anything that would catch fire. When the rescuers found them, the father was frozen 20 yards from the barn, caught in the open when he went to check on the animals. The mother and children were in their beds, peaceful, as if they'd simply decided to sleep and never wake up. The fire had gone out. The house had turned to ice, and there was nothing anyone could have done to save them. 3 families, said Olaf Bergstrom, who brought the news. He stood in Marta's kitchen, holding a cup of coffee in hand still red from the cold. The Jensens, the Nordstroms. Old Henrik didn't make it, but his wife and children survived, and the Olsens burned everything they had and barely held on. "How did you know to come?" Marta asked. "Didn't, for certain. Just had a feeling." He looked at the copper coils, the tank, the system that had kept 3 people alive when 3 families had failed. Figured if anyone made it, it'd be you. Why? Because you built something. He shrugged, as if the answer were obvious. The rest of us just tried to survive the usual way. You built something new. Kristen recovered slowly. The fever had drained her, left her thin and pale and prone to sleeping 14 hours at a stretch. But she was alive. She was getting stronger. And every day she asked for hot water to wash her face, the small luxury that had become somehow a symbol of everything they'd survived. "The water's always warm," she said one morning, marveling at it as if for the first time. "Even in the middle of the night, the water's warm." "That's the system," Thomas said. "The system Papa's supplies built." Did Papa know it would save us? Thomas looked at Marta, uncertain how to answer. Marta thought about Eric, his plans, his dreams, the indoor plumbing he'd never finished, the family he'd never seen through the winter. "I think he hoped it would," she said. "I think he gave us the tools, and we figured out the rest." The woodpile, by mid-February, held just under 1 cord, enough for 3 weeks at normal burn rates, and with the worst of the cold finally breaking, normal burn rates might be enough. They were going to make it. Gunnar Halvorsen arrived on the 20th of February, driving a wagon through roads that had finally been cleared by county crews. He brought salt pork and flour and coffee, supplies he claimed were surplus from his own stores, charity disguised as neighborly excess. Marta let him in. She was tired of fighting people who wanted to help. He walked through the house slowly, examining everything with the careful attention of a man who'd been expecting to find bodies. The stove still burning, the copper coils still wrapped, the tank still warm, the children still alive. "I'll be damned," he said finally. "Mr. Halvorsen." "No, let me." He stopped, gathered himself. "Mrs. Lindgren, I told you arithmetic doesn't lie. I told you 3 chords against 8 means death. I said," his voice caught, "I said that contraption wouldn't change arithmetic." "You did." "I was wrong." The words seemed to cost him something. "The Jensens are dead. The Nordstroms lost Henrik. The Olsens came within a day of losing everyone. And you?" He gestured at the house, the children, the system. "You're standing here making me coffee like nothing happened." "Something happened. We just survived it." He sat heavily in the chair by the stove, looking suddenly old. "I've survived 50 winters on these plains, buried 3 wives, buried neighbors who thought they knew better, thought I understood what it took." He shook his head. "I didn't understand this. I didn't believe it could work." "Neither did I. Not really. Not until it did." "How much wood did you use? Total, October through now?" Marta had kept careful records. 4.8 cords. We have about 9/10 of a cord left. 4.8. He repeated the number like it was a prayer. "I burned 7 cords in my place, and I've got better insulation than you do. 7 cords, and I was cold half the time. The tank holds heat. The system circulates it. The fire doesn't have to work as hard. Show me." He stood up, his curiosity overcoming his exhaustion. "Show me how it works. I have a nephew starting a claim come spring. He needs to know about this." She showed him everything, the coil wrapping, the tank placement, the brass fittings, the air bleed valve. She drew diagrams while he watched, explaining the physics in the same simple terms her father had used 40 years before. Hot water rises, cold water sinks. The tank fills itself if you let it. When she finished, Halvorsen folded the diagrams carefully and tucked them into his coat. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Told you to sell. Told you a woman alone couldn't survive. Told you." He stopped. "I told you a lot of things that turned out to be wrong. You were trying to help. I knew that. Trying to help by telling you to give up. That's not help. That's surrender dressed up as wisdom. He put on his hat, moved toward the door. You proved something out here, Mrs. Lindgren. Proved it with copper and fire and stubbornness. Don't let anyone forget that. He left. Marta stood in the doorway watching his wagon disappear and felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she hadn't known she was carrying, finally letting go. Word spread faster than spring melt. The Lindgren widow had survived on 3 cords of wood. No, 5 cords, but still. She'd built something with copper pipes that cut fuel consumption nearly in half. She'd kept her children alive when families with more resources had failed. Agnes Tvet came first, red-faced and apologetic. I told you clever women freeze just like stupid ones. I was the stupid one. She stood in Marta's kitchen, examining the system with new eyes. Can you teach my boys to build this? I've got one heading out to a new claim come fall. Of course. 3 farmers came the following week, then 2 more, then a widow from the south end of the county who'd heard the story third hand and driven 20 miles to see for herself. Marta showed everyone who asked. She drew diagrams on butcher paper and explained the physics and pointed out the mistakes she'd made so others could avoid them. She never charged a penny. When people asked why she gave away the design instead of profiting from it, she said only, I didn't invent hot water rising. I just remembered what my father knew. The county extension agent appeared in early March, taking notes in a leather-bound book. He asked detailed questions about materials and measurements and costs. When he left, he said the information might appear in a bulletin, something farmers could reference when building their own systems. You've done something remarkable here, he told her. I kept my children alive. That's what mothers do. Not all of them could have done it this way. Reverend Marsh never came back. Marta heard through the Prairie Telegraph that he'd described her survival as providence rather than planning, credited God rather than copper tubing. But the welfare threat evaporated, and no county official ever appeared to question her fitness as a mother. Some battles were won by simply outlasting the opposition. By the end of March, at least 7 farms in Ramsey County had started building thermosiphon systems based on Marta's design. The hardware stores in Devil's Lake reported a run on copper tubing. One owner said he sold more in 6 months than in the previous 3 years. Agnes's sons finished their system in April. Agnes sent word that her fuel consumption had dropped by nearly half. Stupid woman, she wrote in a note delivered with a jar of preserved plums. I should have listened. Forgive me, Marta. Marta Lindgren proved up her claim and paid off the mortgage in 1938. Thomas graduated from high school in 1939, the first in his family to do so. He enlisted in the Navy after Pearl Harbor, served in the Pacific, and came home with a Bronze Star and a wife from San Diego who thought North Dakota winters were some kind of elaborate joke until she lived through one. Kristen became a school teacher in Devil's Lake. She taught 4th grade for 31 years, and every winter she told her students about the time she'd nearly died from fever while the coldest month in state history howled outside her window. My mother saved me with warm water and stubbornness, she'd say. Never underestimate warm water and stubbornness. Marta never remarried. She operated the farm with hired help until 1952, when Thomas returned from California to take over. She lived in the same house where she'd wrapped copper around a stovepipe and taught herself physics, and she kept the system running every winter until the rural electric lines finally reached her road in 1947. She died in her sleep in November of 1961, age 68. They found her in the chair by the stove, a cup of tea gone cold beside her, the fire burned down to coals. The tank in the loft still held warm water. In February of 1936, when the temperature in Parshall reached 60 degrees below zero, Gunnar Halvorsen had given Marta Lindgren a simple equation: 3 cords of wood, 8 cords needed, equals death. A woman alone burning 3 cords when she needs 8 is a woman who freezes to death, he'd said. That contraption won't change arithmetic. He was right about the arithmetic. He was wrong about the contraption. On the coldest night of the coldest month in North Dakota history, Marta Lindgren kept her children alive with copper tubing, a galvanized tank, and the memory of her father's voice explaining how warm water rises and cold water sinks. The fire burned. The water circulated. The tank held its heat through the howling dark. In the morning, the thermometer read 52 below zero. Inside the Lindgren house, a 9-year-old girl woke from her fever, asked for breakfast, and found hot water already waiting.